life. I find it's the most useful tool that there is, especially to remove the sod beforehand. So as you can see today, we're planting these sort of smaller trees, and we're doing that because they're easier to plant, easier to carry, as Jen mentioned, but also a little bit easier to get established. I see a lot of mass plantings of like very large bare root trees or balled and burlap trees with volunteers, and nobody goes back and like make sure that everything is secured, and a lot of times I see a third to a half of them are dead. So I love working with this size because I feel like it's more on a human scale and I see greater success. We're planting them in the fall, they're getting rainfall, they're getting a chance to make good contact with the soil so that in the springtime, when it's time to come out of dormancy and start growing, they really have a head start. So this is great timing, and it's, I think, a great size to work with. Julianne may disagree with that. I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? I feel like this is a great size to work with because I see good success with volunteer planting groups. Yes.
Not to mention how cheap they are compared to the big trees.
Exactly. They're more affordable and they're just more manageable. So I'm going to be removing the sod layer, which is actually fairly substantial here, and that's again something I never find in Philadelphia. I'm usually removing asphalt.
Good.
They're usually not root bound like.
Right, they're nice and loose.
I don't like the container trees.
No.
They're usually. It's a lot of work. So
and these are fairly small, so we're also not having to remove a gigantic area. So if you've gone through the series, you know, we recommend that you make a wider hole rather than a deeper hole. We don't want it to be super deep because we don't want to bury it below its root flare, which you can see is about here on the container. If you look in there, and we're going to spread it out and we're going to loosen the roots, so it's not going to be as deep as this container. Although I'm not sure I need one for a small one. Okay.
That asphalt under there.
It's something hard already.
That's one of those Philadelphia sidewalks under there.
That's true. That's where they've been burying them.
No, it's probably a big suburban
The
problem.
joy of clay, Pennsylvania clay soil.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's under there.
Is there a root?
I know my property, you can't go 5 inches without a rock.
Okay.
3 inches maybe.
Right.
Sometimes 2.
Yeah, it might be a root. I need to move it over.
Yeah, what are we under? Is this a maple?
Yeah.
What kind of a... I see roots there.
Yeah, there's a root there. So I'm just going to move it over a little bit.
Do you want a shovel?
Well, with the shovel, I hit the root first. So it feels like it's a little bit easier to do if I can figure out where everything is.
Fair enough.
Actually, that doesn't really look like clay because it's so crumbled.
It actually does have
What is in there?
pretty nice, like, silty clay or sandy clay.
Yeah.
Things grow really well here. More of a silty clay. It's not falling apart. It's,
Yeah.
I'm getting a nice ball and it's not wet.
Yeah, not awful
So it's a
soils.
mix.
Congratulations. It's not Quakertown.
Kind of like the Nile type of thing, you know?
All clay. That's why they have brickyards
My development, they maybe gave me an inch
of topsoil.
left, so I'm gonna claim.
Oh, after they built?
Yeah. Thank you, DeLuca.
It's going on film.
You do not know who I am.
And if you're moving, removing this sod, it also helps take away some of the stuff that's going to compete with your tree.
And if you've ever cut sod with a shovel, it's an option. To just get, I don't want to put a hole in her yard unnecessarily, but to just get under and shallow. Because the grass roots, as you can see, they're not very deep.
Right, or like even a spade or an edger.
I'll do it where there's an actual tree.
It always has to get reseeded.
Oh, don't say that. That makes me sad. But if you just go in a shallow path, you can just cut away at a sod clump and lift it off that way. Because not everybody brought their hoary knife with them today. Did you? You all did, didn't you? Yeah. I love those.
You
soil
know the
knives,
master
though.
work, it's yours.
Yeah. They are great knives. Sometimes it's just a matter of going around in a circle, cutting the edge, and then suddenly, and this is great too if you are planting a tree but you've got a bare spot somewhere else in the yard, you can just rip this off, take it over, drop it in place, make your own sod.
Now, if you're doing a wide area, Is it
It was,
recommend?
yeah, this was not intended to be quite as wide, but I hit that root.
No,
Yeah.
I meant a whole planting area.
Oh,
that.
to use a drill.
No, to bring in a sod cutter to remove it.
So we don't want to leave bare soil behind
But what if you were to?
between our trees because it's going to take a while for them to establish, and that's going to become a point of erosion all over the property. So we want cover on the ground for as long as possible. The tree canopy is going to start to shade out. You know, it's interesting to hear Kate say that she has to reseed areas. I mean, there is a tree canopy here, and you can see some areas where the shade is kind of making it intolerable growth for the grass species that was planted here by the developer. There are grasses that are more shade tolerant that might take there better. But ultimately, you think about a natural forest floor, it's not covered in turf grass, right? It has leaf cover, some bare spots, things like that. But there's so much tree root that it's not a point of significant erosion. There's also tree canopy, and we talked about before, that's really intercepting a lot of the rain before it ever hits the ground. So someday, when Kate's got a lot of mature trees back here, her goal is to not have to mow this anymore, right? And to not really be managing turf grass. But we don't want to cut all that grass out now. We want to give the trees time to do their job and to get established.
You're obviously planning to put something here right under the canopy.
Yeah, and
Have
so
you
we have,
chosen something
this
that-
is a viburnum,
Okay, so
so
stay
it
low.
is more of an understory species.
Yep.
Yeah,
More
you got
shrubby.
it.
Yep.
You got it.
Okay, so hopefully I've gotten this deep enough. And I've loosened up those roots, which is nice with these small ones as well, because we want it to go out laterally sort of from the plant rather
Is
than...
that what you're supposed to do all the time?
Just
Actually,
stick them
almost
down.
turning it into a bare root plant.
That's what I typically do.
Yeah, I've never seen it done like that. It's interesting.
There's a number of different strategies. You could just take a knife down the sides of the soil clump.
Especially like if it's really compacted.
Right.
Yeah.
You can, and some people cut an X in the base. But with these, it's like so loose and friable, and I don't really want any of that in the planting hole anyway. So I typically remove it. But I always am gonna refer to Julianne.
The expertise of
for
Julianne,
her
who just came
expertise.
again. She just walked into the crowd. She's like, I don't know what we're talking about. So.
And then backfill the hole.
Here's the microphone.
And we'll know if she comes and replants this after you leave. Whether
That's right. If she
She
walks up
follows
and says,
behind
no,
you.
we're going to do that all over again.
Yeah, get that topsoil off the grass clumps if you can. That's good soil.
We don't want to lose those resources.
Now, if you have compost, is it advisable to mix in with the?
So it used to be recommended a long time ago, but more recently research has shown that that isn't really beneficial, so there's no need to do that. People used to excavate this very large hole, put in a lot of compost, stick in a plant, and think that that was beneficial. But research doesn't show that that is actually beneficial. We wanted to exploit the existing soil that's here, and we wanted to make good root contact with the soil that exists. So there's really no need to do that. And so then again, you're going to want to look for the area where the tree starts to get fatter
Got it.
and
Perfect.
transitions to the roots.
So hard
And you're going to
find them.
avoid, it's a little, that's one thing that's a little bit harder with these really small trees, is being able to see that as clearly, although with this one it's pretty easy.
Yeah, that one has a nice flare.
And we're not looking to make any of those great big depressions or volcanoes, just level soil. And one of the biggest failures I see with tree planting is that people stop right now and walk away, but they don't firm it up. I see that a lot, especially with plantings with kids. Nobody goes back and checks and firms it up and then makes sure that it is making good contact. But keep in mind that those roots we just put in the soil, unless they are actually making good contact with that soil, they're not able to exploit what's in there. So that is not going to lead to a successful planting.
And then the other thing, you don't want to press it down too much, right? 'Cause then you
No, but
squeeze
with
all
your
the air out.
hands, you're not going to press it down too
Right.
much.
Don't
Like, you're
bring
not
your
going to
tamper
come
out.
You don't want to go like this, right? You don't want to stamp on it.
Right. It doesn't
Not
need
use
to be
it.
concrete, but it should be nice and sturdy and be able to make good contact with the soil that it is seeded in.
So since
And
this
hopefully
is a
nice and
portion of the
straight as
yard
well.
that might be underwater at some point.
Yes. Could
do
be.
you worry about, I mean, I'm sure you've had projects where you've planted a whole bunch of stuff and an unusual storm came and just lifted them all out?
It
They washed
certainly
them?
happens. Last year and the year before, with both floods in the fall,
Yeah.
there had just been a number. So in Philadelphia, we have a big tree planting. It's actually coming this weekend. And that had just happened before both of those.
Yeah.
And all of those were sitting
Lifted.
sideways with the roots up in the air. And some of them survived, some didn't. You know, ideally you want to make sure things are secure and that you're choosing riparian species that can tolerate being wet if they need to be wet. But again, it's kind of hard to predict when another storm is going to come
Now,
along.
could you go in and actually replant those, and some of those actually took?
Typically you can, especially if you're quick, right? So the less time that those are exposed to the air, the less time they're out of the soil, the better off you are. And so not everything will survive, and sometimes things actually get moved even downstream
Yeah.
if it's a really powerful
Sure.
force of water. But in general, if you're quick and you're on top of what's happening, because that's a maintenance task, right? Like
Yeah.
that's part of maintaining that planting.
I did lose a lot of trees and shrubs that
Yep.
I had newly planted in Ida. Like they were gone. Like a big golden burlap, red maple that was staked,
Yeah.
just gone. Yeah, and so
That's powerful water.
yeah.
That is
Did you
powerful.
ever
water.
find it?
No, I lost that.
Someone
and this,
got a free tree.
this heron's
Me?
sculpture
No,
that I
this
went
is
up
actually
and down,
waterproof. Thank
Colorado,
you.
looking for it. But that's part of my frustration is that was a big trade and it left a big hole, and then that created a problem because now that's eroding. So it's something to think about when you choose where you're planting things.
Right, to think about the location and what can be tolerated.
Yeah,
at
like
that
I thought it'd be
location.
good to put it close to hold the bank because it really was far away from the stream, probably like 5 feet. But when that water came right then, and if
It just
happened-
hadn't put any real roots into
Exactly. If it
stable
had
soil.
been next year,
Yeah.
it probably would have been okay, but it was only in there for like 6 months.
And that's one strategy that restoration researchers have discovered in the last several years, like at the Smithsonian Research Center where they do a lot of wetlands work. They've discovered that there is a benefit to being diverse in your planting time in addition to being diverse in your plantings, because something that is a second year or a second season growth can sometimes withstand the force of whatever is happening in a storm better than something planted at a different time. So,
Yeah.
you know,
What is that? A button bush?
this is not. This is
Viburnum?
no. It's what you brought. It's not.
What I brought? Persimmon?
Possible.
Or
We're gonna need Julianne to do.
Julianne, what kind of tree did we just plant?
I think it's a persimmon.
It's opposite though. So what were the choices?
For out here, it's either redbud, basswood,
red.
viburnum,
It
button bush, or
might be a
viburnum. Yeah, so if it was one of the basswoods, one of the things I would do right now, or even the redbud, would be to think about how to make this be a tree and not a bush, but it is a bush, right? But you're looking at it right now and it doesn't really have a central leader. Right. It's been pruned off at the top and has 2 leaders, and so I would give it one if it were a tree before I put it in this tube. And we are going to put all the trees here today in tubes because who lives here?
I have a lot of deer friends.
So the tubes are primarily in this location being installed to help reduce the deer pressure so that she actually gets some growth out of these trees, and they get up to about 5 feet tall before the deer can start eating them. They sell shorter tubes. I don't honestly know what they're for because they don't provide a lot of services and deer can eat right into them, right? So we really only use the 5-foot tubes now. The shorter tubes are sold as what we call shrub tubes, and that's great because it allows shrubs to grow like shrubs. They like to get wide fast, they like to spread out, but they're better off just not being in tubes, right? If that's the case. It's just one less thing to plant. One of the other things that tubes can provide a service as is intercepting the floodwaters first with hopes that they can disperse some of the pressure. Instead of it hitting the tree, it hits the stake, it hits the tube. And in a minor flood event, you have a lot less damage to deal with. But a major event can pull a ball and burlap maple tree out of the ground and take it so far away that you never see it again, and somebody else gets a free tree out of it. So,
What's your source for the tubes? Or
so every day they get a little easier to get. There's this huge online retailer I shall not name that you can buy anything from. Anything. So they are available there now. You can order them from like tree and forest supplier type retailers online as well, because we don't have like a forestry supply shop in Montgomeryville, which is weird because there's everything else there. But sometimes nursery centers can get them for you. This company that makes this tube that we like is called Tubex. And they are really just a wholesale company, so they're a little harder to find. But the Keystone 10 Million Trees Initiative that's been providing trees has also been providing a lot of tubes and stakes along with the trees, which has been really great. There are a number of other types of tree shelters available out there. You'll see companies, there's one called Plantra. Their tubes are shipped flat instead of round. You have to kind of pop them open, and then they have like twist ties instead of zip ties, and the stakes for those are made of fiberglass instead of wood. In some cases that's better because they last longer, but I have actually found that those fiberglass stakes are really hard to get back out of the ground, and they're not a natural material, so they're not going to decompose if they're stuck there. So I don't prefer to use them, but some people do, and it's to each their own. Some folks will use just fencing on stakes. You can use like the orange soil fence, or you can buy chicken wire and just make little cages around them as well. It's totally up to you how you do it. The cages aren't going to diffuse the power of floodwaters very much, so that's a reduced benefit. And one of the other things these little tubes do is they actually do extend your growing season just a little bit. They do act as mini greenhouses, which is nice. And I was talking to Kate this morning about how long they stay on. This is her yard. She can take them off whenever she wants. But when we're managing a site, we'll leave them on for 5 years, and or longer or shorter. It depends on how fast the trees are growing, what species are in there. With some of these shrubs, they're going to start really hating being inside of a tube after 5 years, and they're going to be crowded in there, and they're going to really want to be pushy. So if they've gotten a really nice strong hold, one of the things I'll tell Kate she can do is like take a knife or scissors and cut the top of the tube off, and at least let the shrubs start spilling out and getting a little pushier fill. For the trees, right, if this tree had a tube on it, you can see at some point the trunk is larger than the tube. And if it's pressing against the inside of the tube, it's very humid in there. The tree starts to think it's got a whole new layer of bark, or that it's underground, and it'll make the bark wet and start to rot. It'll start to grow air roots in there, and we don't want that, right? We want the tree to be strong, and we want it to be healthy. So when the width of the tree starts to get close to the size of the tube, you really want to get it off. If you've got problems with buck, right, which is different than the deer coming along and just chewing on them, the buck will come through and rub the velvet off their antlers on just about anything they can find. And so if you've got a small tree, it doesn't take them long to get all the way around that tree and do what we call girdling, which is they cut a full circle of bark off, and that'll kill the tree. And so sometimes these have a perforation. They're meant to break away on their own, but they do not. But you can cut that or tear it open, but then leave the tube kind of wrapped around the tree, and it'll prevent the buck from rubbing all the bark off. So that's an option. These tubes that we get from Tubex, they have a couple of different varieties. We like the ones with the holes in them. It allows some ventilation. It doesn't get quite as humid, but it actually also allows some wind to get in there, so the tree's blowing around. If you've ever heard like staking a tree and just leaving it staked for a long period of time, actually makes the tree weaker because it's not getting natural strength, right? It's like never walking and then expecting your legs to work when you finally get up to do it, right? It's the same thing with the tree. So we like these ones with the holes. It gives them some wind strength. We twist these down into the dirt because we're trying to keep what from getting inside?
Holes and bowls.
Hot pockets on legs.
Yes, hot pockets on legs. I love it. That's why I bring Julianne. Here in this environment, I'm actually going to turn that around a little bit. We have voles and stuff running around, but they're mostly going to follow where they can get under the leaf litter, where they can stay out of sight, because there are plenty of predators around here too, right? Lots of red-tailed hawks, lots of things looking for those guys. So as long as Kate keeps up with mowing out here, keeps the grasses short, she probably won't have a lot of vole pressure in these tubes. But if you're in a more natural area, you're allowing tall meadow grasses and things to grow up around your stream, which some people like to do, know that voles are going to take advantage of that cover, and they're going to run around, and in the winter especially, they're going to burrow up into your tubes, set up camp, and eat your tree all winter. And it's delicious. And then you're gonna come back in the spring and you're gonna be checking on your trees, and you're gonna reach in there and tug on your tree, and it's just gonna come out. And it's not gonna be attached to anything. It's gonna have a nice sharp point at the bottom, and you can use it as a weapon, but that's about it. So one of the things that is recommended to keep the voles out of the tubes and to keep that pressure down is actually to put a ring of stone mulch around these tubes in areas where you've got taller vegetation. You can buy just like modified 2A gravel by the bucketful and dump it in a ring. They say about a half of a 5-gallon bucket per tube. So prepare to get a good shoulder workout if you decide to go that route.
Modified 2A gravel?
Yeah, that's the kind that they use for gravel roads. It's got the bigger pieces, but it has kind of the fines mixed in too, so it sort of packs it together, and it's really going to keep the voles from getting in there.
You just pile it up at the bottom?
Yeah, you're basically making a ring around the tube with about a half a bucket's worth.
Yeah, I mean, that would come up about 3 inches on there, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to spread out a little bit,
Yeah.
because it's just going to naturally,
Right.
you know, tumble down. But yeah, you're going to make it so it's basically impenetrable to voles. We put the stake part of the tube on the side of the tree that's going to get the most pressure from floodwaters. So where do the floodwaters come from, Kate? Point to their origin.
Well, they come from several
Okay.
directions.
Yep, so we have to make a decision here.
Yeah, I mean, they come directly behind the stream here,
Uh-huh.
and they come from Eagle Lane on this side over here.
Okay.
This fence.
Come from the fence, they come from there. Do they ever actually come out of the stream itself?
It did last year.
Wild. But that's the last place.
I think it's debatable, Dad. If it
Mostly
came from
across,
this side.
mostly sheet flow across the neighbor's yard.
Yeah.
So we want the stake to be pointed towards the flood, right? Think about what directions. A lot of times if you're right adjacent to a stream and the stream is the source of the floodwater, you just put the stake on the upstream side. But that's not a foolproof plan if most of your flood pressure is coming from the neighbor's yard, right? So that's what we're thinking about. So we turn this until that is in that direction, give it a little push to get it started, and then somewhere in one of my buckets, this is where you get to see whether or not I have good eye-hand coordination. I'm going to actually come around this side. I'm sorry about the camera. Ah, I was so close to making a perfect demonstration. I am terrible with a hammer and a nail. I have bent every nail I've ever tried to put into anything ever.
Seems like it's pretty hard in
It
hard
is
soil.
some pretty solid soil, so this is going to be another good upper body workout today. How many of you were rowers or swimmers?
I was.
God, excellent. You're in charge of mallet duty today.
Notice we're all way back here.
It's as if they know me. That's actually not bad. You want to keep moving that until it's not going to move any further. I don't want to be able to just pull it right back out of the ground. I don't want to be able to wiggle it and have it pop really loose again. And this is actually not as tight as I'd like it to be. So I'm going to hit it a few more times. But the further down you get it, the better. And if you have dug a rather large hole, right? If Beth had dug a wider hole, we would have had to go a lot deeper because she would have disturbed a lot of soil.
Yeah.
And so in some cases, folks have been buying the drill bits you can put on your hand drill, which is fine. But two things about those. One is make sure you know what size pot you're working with. Don't bring out the power auger bit for these little pots, because you're just gonna have a huge hole. And also be really attentive to how deep you're going, because if you make your hole too deep, right, even if you fill it back in again to get it to the right level, first big rainstorm event or flood event, your trees are all going to sink down into the ground, right? And then they just become little swimming pools for trees every time it rains. And we see a lot of tree mortality on planting sites where they've used those drill bits to pre-do the holes if attention hasn't been paid to how deep those holes are. Better to go a little too shallow and then come back and dig it a little bit more than to go too deep and be trying to fill them back in again. That's been our experience anyway. I don't know if you've had experience with auger bits different from that, but
No, same.
yeah, they tend to be a little too much. There we go. I'm happy with that. And then this other really critical step somehow gets missed. People get in a hurry and people forget, but you have to actually attach the tube to the stake, and that requires tightening these zip ties. These are magical zip ties. Magical zip ties. They have reverse buttons on them.
No way.
Have you ever met a reverse zip tie? They're really hard to find to replace, so you have to break them. But the ones that come with these TubeX tubes have a little button you can push and open it back up.
That's so
Ta-da! Which is amazing. So if you have to take the tube back off for some reason, you can loosen them, lift the tube off, put the tube back on. What kind of reason might you have in a year from now or 2 years from now to lift the tube up?
Theoretically, you could reuse it.
You could be reusing it, absolutely, not just theoretically. I encourage it.
You want to inspect the tree too sometimes.
You might want to be inspecting the tree. You might have weeds that have started growing inside the tube.
Yeah.
And you have grasses that are emerging out the top of the tube, and you're like, where did those come from? And so lifting the tube up, cleaning all that out, so that all that's left behind in there is the tree. How do weeds get inside the tube? Well, you're going to be attracting wildlife.
Oh, good.
Oh, good. More plastic, right? There are a lot of opportunities to introduce plastic into the environment. And we just learned in the news this week that it's everywhere. Penn Environment just released a research study that there are microplastics in every stream in Pennsylvania, everywhere you can imagine. So here's some more. But these are called bird nets. We use them because birds do like to perch on top of these tubes. Especially fledglings in the spring when they're first learning to fly will look for anything to land on because they are very unsteady and unwary. And when a fledgling lands on top of here, there's a really good chance it's also going to fall in the tube when it tries to land. And they really don't have the ability to get back out, right? They're not helicopters. They can't fly straight up in the air. The tree is only about this high, so even if they climb the tree, it's not going to help them get out. So until the tree is close to the top of the tube, we put these nets on so that if they do land on top of the tube, the chances of them falling in are very slim. We have installed these 82 different ways in the last 15 years, and every couple of years someone tells us there's a new way to do it. The science keeps changing. It's usually Straub Research Center that is telling us that it's changed one more time. So when we first started installing them, they looked like this and they had funny little hats. And what we learned was that birds actually came along and took them and used them for various things. So then we started tucking them in like little volcanoes, and then the trees got stuck in them if you didn't get out here in time. And so now we do the donut method. And the donut method is exactly what it sounds like, right? There's a hole, so if the tree gets to the top of the tube before you get back to take the net off, it has an escape route. It's amazing how gentle trees are, but also how permanent that twist and awfulness will be once they get caught in the net and you take it off, and you end up having to prune your tree back down to a straight point, or you end up with this wild looking chaotic tree. We see a lot of those out in the more wild area buffers.
Jen, did you mention the top versus the bottom of the tube? Because we had that at a planting out upside down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the holes go up, right? The solid area is at the bottom. There are a couple of reasons for that. These tubes are designed with a flare so that when there's not nets and the tree is up at the top and it's exposed, if it's blowing in the wind, it's not rubbing against a sharp edge, it's not stripping the bark off, that flare goes out. There's no flare on the bottom half. The ventilation is at the top, just, heat rises, it's all those things. For locations where people want to use weed killers, which is an option, right? You could manage the competition if you have a particularly weedy, invasive weeds area. Using some herbicide chemicals around the base of the tree can help with that. Make sure you're properly using them. Make sure you're only using them on your own property or you're a certified applicator. I have lots of other stories I can include in that in the future if you have questions. But the wall of the tube is solid. That way the herbicides are not getting inside the tube and killing your tree, depending on what kind of weeds you're working with. They might have the same growth habit as the tree, and your herbicide might actually kill the tree.
Jen, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Do you know how much this assembly costs with all 3 pieces?
So I do off the top of my head. It's hard to buy one tube and one stake, but when you
Right.
buy them in like 25 and 25, it comes into, used to be like $3 a setup, but now it's probably closer to $5
Okay.
when you
Close
buy
enough.
them in bulk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And how tall is that stake?
So we use the 5-foot setup, and these are hardwood stakes, 1-inch hardwood stakes. You can get 1-inch hardwood stakes at like the big box hardware stores around here. The tubes will be a little harder to come by. And again, but it's also cheaper to ship the tubes than it is to ship stakes. So if you can source your stakes locally, you'll save yourself a lot of money in shipping costs. They're just heavy. You had a question?
You know, if you do choose to use the herbicide, should you take care not to saturate the ground?
So every herbicide has a different action. Some well, I don't know, there's not any soil drench herbicides. Those are all insecticides. Yeah, because there are some pesticides that soil drench is actually the technique to utilize them, but that's not for herbicide treatment. Most herbicides either act on existing vegetation, usually through contact, or they are systemic herbicides that act on emergence, so they prevent germination or like new growth from happening in the future. The ones that are on contact tend to dissipate rather quickly. They're pretty short lifetime, but the pre-emergence, the ones that treat seeds and stuff, they can last for a really long time, some of them up to 6 or 12 months. So that's why you want to read the packages really carefully and think about how long they're going to be acting at the site that you're using them. There's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it has to do with what kinds of weeds you're actually trying to compete with. Are you dealing with grass weeds? Are you dealing with herbaceous, non-grassy plants? Or are you dealing with woody, aggressive plants, poison ivy vines and things like that that you don't want because you have an allergy situation, or oriental bittersweet vines because they're just the most awful thing in the world. It's a shame. Porcelain berry. Do you guys get porcelain berry down here?
So much.
Oh, awful. It's awful, and it's getting worse. So, knotweed has its own. That's its own story. So it depends on what you're battling against. Kate's really only got turf grass here, so we're lucky. Like not a lot of competition, but you might have a much bigger invasive weed problem to begin with.
I have a huge weed problem, but I choose not to use the herbicide.
Yeah, which is fine.
Deal with it.
Yep.
The whole yard is weeds.
Yeah, some situations are worse than others. Sometimes the presence of the invasive weed is actually more harmful to the environment than the herbicide you might be using to battle it. But that is not a reason to just willy-nilly throw chemicals around without any education about what you're targeting and how you're doing it. So that's kind of my story usually when it comes to herbicides. This is a pretty cool tool. Julian just walked over with.
So
The weed wrench?
Yeah, weed wrench. They no longer make it, but if you Google weed wrench, they will show the alternative to it. And this is lovely because it's for woody tissue. You can take something up to 1 inch, use the leverage to yank it out, and it'll take out the whole thing by the crown and not disturb the soil appreciably. So
Bradford pears, Japanese barberry.
I'll give you $100 for that. Give you $100 right now.
no.
200.
Do I hear 1,000?
The mulberry bushes, because they're taking
White
over.
mulberries.
Yeah.
As
And
long
black.
as-
As long as it's under 1 inch.
Yeah.
Multi-floor.
Yeah. Yeah, they're excellent. So it's either that or goats. Those are your choices. So this is it. So now it's your turn